Dr. Seabrook, thank you so much for coming on Northern Vibe. I'm rather chuffed, if I can make the observation, at the prospect of a splendid chat with you.
Well, thank you. I think what you're doing, to bring local people on and have these discussions on the Northern Vibe is really a worthwhile thing to do. So thank you for including me.
Oh no, look, it's the thing that I'm finding with it, Doc, is there's all these people who are amazing achievers. They're experts in their own field. They've really contributed to the community and society and to their specific ambit of expertise. And I just like shining a light on what people are doing and meeting new and interesting people. So it's a win-win situation. That much I can assure you of. So if you wouldn't mind telling us about you, if we could kind of kick off with that, your background, your interests, your qualifications, and what you're up to.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, Matt, as you probably tell by accent, unfortunately, even though I've been here more than half my life in Australia, I grew up in the northern suburbs of London, and I actually decided that I would come to Australia when I was 14, and I first got the paperwork when I was 16 from the Australian Embassy in Trafalgar Square, and it took a few years. But basically, I came over to do managed to come over and to do my PhD, which I did on cane toads. And really, but now I'm living outside Cooktown on a farm, just a small farm on the Endeavour Valley Road. It's the road that goes through to Hopevale. Mm. And I had a farm down in northern New South Wales, and I was very much growing food organically there. And it was really, I suppose, over the last few decades, been a transition from working with endangered species, working with pest species like cane toads, feral cats, and things like that, and to be more interested in that, so much of our land is being given over for growing food for agriculture. And we're busy sort of trying to maintain all these biodiversity within these nature reserves and national parks, and so many threats on them. And meanwhile, what was happening out in the agricultural landscape, we were losing biodiversity. We now know we were losing huge amounts of carbon, other sort of environmental issues. And so I became more interested in working with farmers through land care, through catchment management, to support them to improve what they were doing. Within obviously the sort of the confines, like everybody else, of the need to make an income. So yeah, I worked in land care and catchment management, but I look back now, Matt, and I sort of think, talk about sort of your topic, sort of looking into curiosity, and I was looking at thinking how many years I've spent working with farmers and doing in my own small farm, growing food sustainably. And so basically maintaining, so your whole goal was to maintain the soil, the growing conditions that you had. And you would use a whole lot of inputs and compost and biofertilizers and mulch and things like that to do that. And when I moved up to Cooktown, like a lot of other people who sort of first come to Cooktown, I was just passing through, and then that seems to be the sort of pattern that we end up staying. And I part of the reason why I stayed, but I think I would have stayed anyway, is I got the job to sort of kickstart the land care program on Cape York Peninsula. So I was sort of busy doing that. I was working in town, living in town, but doing up a house with the idea to buy a farm outside of town, and to really just sort of experiment with how I could use more of my ecological backgrounds in terms of the way that I grew food and delving into the science behind it. And what's come from that has been a journey that's been sort of 15 years, I suppose, learning practically on the farm, and learning through being, my background in research, and sort of starting to realize that they were looking at regenerative agriculture, looking at what worked, what didn't work, and developing more of an eco-logical approach to regenerative agriculture at any scale. So when I talk about the word agriculture, I mean it's the growing, it's the cultivation of food. So it can be in people's food gardens, or it can be 6,000 acre property
at an industrial scale. Well, that's very interesting, I must say. And look, you've said it's crazy to ignore the intelligence embedded in natural ecosystems, especially since nature has undertaken the research and development in every growing condition on the planet, including our own. Would you mind expanding on that?
Yeah, well, if you look at, so I'm going to get political now, I'm sure you don't mind, but if you look at the way that so much of the funding is at the moment, it's all about agri-tech. It's all about developing technologies to solve growing issues. Now, there's no problem with that. Drones, laser levelers, GPS guided tractors, all of those. So there's no problem with those. But what I feel is that you're sort of saying is that there's 3 billion years of research and development embedded in natural systems, and why aren't we learning more from those? And that's where obviously the business name comes from, learning from nature. But it's also sort of interesting, Matt, as well, is that we and I'm sort of guilty of this too, is that what we do is we go out and if we're a gardener, we sort of think, right, what's wrong with my soil? It's a bit compacted. What are my neighbors doing? And we might sort of say, oh, somebody's putting on, obviously they're putting on mulch and they're putting on compost, but somebody's buying some dolomite, or it might be gypsum, or it might be lime, or whatever. And if you're more into doing it more commercial, you'll get a soil test, and it will come out with all of these different recommendations, and they might be for either chemical inputs or for organic inputs. And then above ground, we've got various problems with pests and diseases and things like that. But really, what I realized is that all of those things are symptoms, they're indicators that the actual ecosystems in our farms and gardens aren't working well. So let me give you a sort of practical example, is that you can put... this is a very good practical example. People put mulch onto their around their fruit trees, onto their veggie garden, and inevitably we all sort of end up whinging and sort of saying, God, it disappeared so quickly. How come it disappeared so quickly? And I don't see any long-term benefit. And so what's happening with that? It is breaking down. And it is being, some of those nutrients are being used by the plants to obviously as nutrients. But the thing is, we now know that if we want to increase the amount of organic matter in our soil, we need to have it from the roots. We need to have it from dead and decaying roots, and we need to have it from root exudates, the sugars and proteins that plants put out through their roots. Nearly all plants do this, but I mean, I remember 20 odd years ago, or maybe a bit longer, but when scientists first realized that these plants were secreting sugars through their roots, they thought there was something wrong with the plant, and they called it the leaky root syndrome. And of course, now we know that it's basically the plant is changing the recipe to feed the soil organisms. And so the approach that we've had has been to sort of put inputs on, put mulch on, put compost on, rather than saying, what is it rather than saying the root cause of the problem is the ecosystem. So in the soil, if we want to increase organic matter, we're not going to do it just by putting mulch on the soil, but we are, because it breaks down. We're not even going to do it just by having a lot of roots in the soil. It's actually the soil organisms that do that work. And that is an ecological process.
It's interesting because the implication is, like, we're farming the plants, but the plants are farming the soil, or more accurately, the animals that live in the soil and regenerate it. So there's clearly a kind of relationship there. So this concept, this pattern, I suppose, of farming goes way down, really.
Yeah, I mean, you know, when if you look at the history of farming over the last 12,000 years, just as a general picture, there's obviously exceptions to this, particularly, you know, with indigenous farmers who've maintained self-fertilizing systems. What we've done is we've neglected the ecological parts of our production systems. So I sort of when I'm sort of doing workshops and webinars and things like that, and you're talking particularly to farmers, we'll talk about their production systems. Or we could talk about, let's say, a production system that's producing chocolate covered biscuits.
Okay.
And you know, there's a whole lot of raw materials that come into that production line, right? There's a whole lot of different bits of equipment and machinery that do different jobs, and out come the chocolate biscuits at the end. And at a garden scale, it's really no different. We have seeds, we have grafted fruit trees, we have weaners, we have, you know, whatever, livestock. A farmer will go in or a gardener will go in, they might dig their soil, they might plow their soil, they might spray herbicides, they may not, they might put compost on, they might put fertilizers on, the crop might come up, they might get some pest and disease problems, they might spray some stuff, and at the end, food comes out at the other end. But if you, like any production system, if you don't maintain it, and you know how everything is so much nowadays about efficiency. Yep. So it's about removing all, you know, how as a business or an organization can I save money by reducing sort of any sort of redundancy in a way. So any duplication in the system, that makes that so there's a couple of things that we know from what happens with production systems when they get run down, they're not maintained, is that they're more likely to break down. And going back to those chocolate covered biscuits, they're more likely to come out at the end of the production line without a proper coating of chocolate biscuits. Yeah. So if you have just keeping with that chocolate coated biscuit production line a bit longer, you know, if you've got that, your Arnold's or whatever, and you've got that happening, what are you going to do? Are you going to buy an extra piece of machinery and to put aside, pay somebody to pick out those biscuits that haven't been properly coated and then run them through an extra bit of machinery? Or are you going to look at your production system and see how it's working, what the problem is? And I think fundamentally, following that metaphor or analogy through, is that we've neglected the ecological components in our food production systems. And going back to the soil example, if you think about it, we've designed, you know, what manages the soil.
Oh, sorry. I thought you meant that rhetorically, but obviously, so I'm thinking earthworms and other microorganisms in the soil. So you know, you've got your myriad of other beasties, I suppose, in there that are in the relationship with the soil.
Yeah. Yes. And so they're basically the operators of the soil ecosystem. But if you think about the way that what we've done is let me widen it a little bit, is that we've basics, particularly over this last second, so I'm sort of rambling a little bit here, over the last sort of, particularly over the last 50 or so years, what we've done is we've designed our farms and gardens to mass produce a couple of crops and meat and dairy products. And that's our production systems. And what we've done is we're growing vegetation to feed, either to produce crops for us or grass and for livestock. And what we failed to do is think about the resources to the soil ecosystem, to the soil organisms.
Yeah, yeah, I'm following you.
Okay, so we don't, and so what happens if you don't, what happens to us if we don't get we don't get it fed enough food and good enough quality? We don't function.
Exactly. But like, isn't it linked though? This is just out of curiosity. So
yeah,
I think you're quite right to observe that. Obviously, we're getting these massive monolithic crops. So you'll get wheat, acres and acres and acres and acres of wheat, or whatever it is, specific crop that you're doing. But because the specific outcome is that, you're going to design the crop that you're going to design is the wrong word, but you're going to try and influence the soil specifically for that crop. And I just want to make sure that I'm getting correct what you're saying. So is that, I mean, that's good long-term for that crop, but your argument is that long-term, it's not good for the diversity and the ability of the soil to grow other crops. Is that correct? Have I got it right?
Well, for the whole system. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And in a way, I think what we've done is we've, this change has been, we've looked at and we've sort of said, it's the clearing of native vegetation, a loss of biodiversity, and the degradation of our soil. It's unfortunate, but it's the collateral damage in a way of us being able to grow enough food.
Yeah. And
so the whole focus, and again, go increasingly over the last 50 years, the whole focus has been on really focusing all of those nutrient resources and energy and solar energy, because plants need, and we all need energy as well as nutrients, into mass producing one or two crops, meat and dairy products. And it's sort of been argued that that's the way to do it. And up until recently, we've been able to ride that wave in a way. We've had farmers have had access to cheap inputs. And now, of course, all the concern is about the cost of fertilizers. We're also running out of things like phosphate resources. So there's the sort of the resource supply issue. And the other thing, of course, that's making it, so that's adding to the costs for farmers. But the other thing that's happening is that the climate is changing. So and what we've developed is production systems where there's so little biodiversity, but it's more than that. That's what I'm really wanting to say. The system itself is functioning like that biscuit processing thing that's been run down, and so it's more likely to break down. So when we have ecosystems that are functioning, let's take it down. If we have a soil that's functioning well, that's got really good soil structure, it's got good aggregate structure, a lot of organic matter. When we get a drought, before we get that drought and we get rain, we're going to get more of that rain infiltrating into the soil, and we're going to get more of it stored in the soil. When we do get the drought, there's going to be more water stored in that soil. So there's more resilience built into that system. So, I mean, eventually that it will dry out, but you've buffered your farm, your garden for a bit longer than your neighbor who's got compacted soil with very little organic matter. And organic matter is just if people aren't aware about it, it's just it's all of the plant and animal waste material that is converted into that sort of dark color that we see in healthy soils. And at the other end of the spectrum, if we get flooding rains, and if you can see the soils where there's very little structure, because you'll get ponding there. And whereas the soils where you've got a functioning soil ecosystem, you will get better water infiltration and drainage down through that soil.
So are you basically advocating organic farming or rewilding? And is there a difference? What would you mind?
No, I'm not advocating either of them. I'm actually just advocating, it's really interesting one, Matt. I'm advocating that we focus on repairing the ecosystems rather than treating the symptoms. So organic farming is an input-based system.
Right.
So you're not using superphosphate, you're using compost and biological fertilizers.
Yeah, okay.
So what learning from nature and growing food eco-logically is about is how can we design our gardens and farms so that we repair the ecosystems within them.
Okay.
So, you know, we've talked for years about planting trees along the edges of our fields, along the creeks and things like that, and at the bottoms of our gardens. But and in the way that's sort of like bringing back those natural ecosystems into those edges of our production. But what I'm saying is that we need to bring those ecosystems, functioning ecosystems, back into our farms and gardens. So we talked about soils a little bit.
Yeah.
You know, you're not going to have a healthy soil structure that promotes root growth, nice deep roots, that promotes biodiverse communities of soil organisms without that functioning ecosystem. And we're not going to do that unless and this is where the simplicity is, because it's really just a matter of giving your soil organisms a better diet.
That's simple. And that seems to make sense. Is there a relationship between the specific soil organisms that exist in, say, a wheat field as opposed to, you know, a eucalypt forest, or like are they the same? And do pardon my ignorance on this. Are they the same animals, the same beasts that are doing all the heavy lifting, or are there different? Are there different animals for different crops? Of different.
Yeah, I mean, the diversity is huge, and there may well be some similar microbes, and there's probably a few earthworms in each, but yeah, there will be changes. Arable field or wheat field will tend to be more bacteria dominated, whereas your eucalypt forest will be more fungal dominated. So there are differences, but I think this is where you know, there are huge problems with the way that we grow food. We've lost huge numbers of birds from our agricultural landscapes, huge number of insects, especially when you go into places like Europe. I mean, I think they did some work in Germany where I can't remember the figures, but it was in nature reserves across the country, and they had light insect collectors that attract insects with light, and they were monitoring the insect abundance, and it's declined something like 80%. And so we've got huge losses of carbon from our agricultural soils, and we all know we need to get more carbon out of the atmosphere and back into our soils. And so the growing food ecologically, getting the ecosystems back into our farms and gardens functioning, not only does it benefit gardeners, because basically they can reduce the amount of inputs that they have to have, so therefore buy. It reduces the amount of time that they need to spend applying all those inputs and digging and all of that sort of stuff. But the other thing is, so that's a positive. That's a way of engaging maybe with people who you know in the old days, a lot of the farmers that you would engage with sustainable agriculture would be the ones who'd already paid off their mortgages and were a little bit more of a sort of have a greeny bent. But now I would say that the vast majority of farmers are more aware and more, more interested in what can I do to help. And this enables, this approach enables them to get involved without having to worry about sort of income losses, because, you know, profitability isn't just about yield, it's also about your net versus your gross.
Of course, yeah.
So, but the other thing too is that when you start growing food in functioning ecosystems, then you're bringing back all nature's free ecological services, and all of those other ecological services that ecosystems provide. So like clean air, clean water, carbon sequestration, biodiversity, you're supplying naturally as a byproduct from repairing the ecosystems.
Does this, and oh look, I'm obviously, you know, that's kind of makes sense. Does this impact on productivity, either positively, negatively, or neither here nor there, or neutrally?
So, you know, there the interesting thing is there's the regenerative farmers who are working towards repairing their ecosystems, who they're very often people who are saying, they go about it by saying, you know, if I wasn't growing food on this land, what would the natural vegetation look like? What would there be grazing animals in my system? How can I mimic that? And I can give you a good example. Somebody who was quite, when I was going all through, don't forget, I was going through all of this. I was organic. I was putting compost in. On the farm here, I was trying to spread lime through a fertilizer spreader. And if there's any farmer who is listening to this conversation, they'll know that would be pretty challenging. I was standing on the back, sort of shoving the lime down through. And I'm sorry, I've lost my train of thought where I was going there. So,
it was just in regards to, like, it was a productivity issue, and so you were discussing that like it was kind of like, initially that the farmers that were involved were of a lefty greeny bent, but now it's becoming more and more mainstream, and the lime was one of the inputs that I think that you were discussing.
Yes, and so it's easier for farmers to get engaged because they're reducing their input costs. And maybe this is a good time to give some examples. And he and his wife inherited, I think it was her farm, and they've spent the last 20 years regenerating it, because this isn't a quick fix, but farmers quickly start to see the benefits. But what he did, and this is where it's sort of really interesting, is he had a remnant bit of the prairies, grassland on his property.
Right.
And he also knew that the whole of his property would have been prairies. And so the prairies are an extremely diverse ecosystem. And, you know, and we all know that the buffalo were the ones that were sort of roaming the plains and at that time. And so he sort of said, I'm growing crops. How can I change the way that I'm growing crops to better mimic what's happening in that prairie ecosystem? Because he dug in the soil and looked at it and thought, my God, you know, this is everything that I would like in my fields. And so he started growing a mixture of plants, which is called a cover crop, and it's starting to come into the sort of gardening circle now. So it's a mixture of plants that are grown between the cropping cycle. So you finish your main crop, your commodity crop, and then you put in your this cover crop. And in the States now, there's huge numbers of farmers are now doing this instead of leaving their soil bare. And they're growing different plants, a whole mixture of plants, and some, you know, not just legumes, which are the ones that have the bacteria in their roots to fix the nitrogen from the air, but also deep-rooted plants to reduce soil compaction, beneficial insect attracting plants, a whole mixtures, so to address particular resource issues. So, but in doing that, that was one key way that he was able to mimic the prairies, and that was to be able to say that he was growing plants for as much of the year as possible. So keeping in mind that, and he talks about this, so he's got some footage of, you know, -40 degrees, and his cattle are still out there shoveling under the snow and eating the sort of forest, what's left of the forage radish underneath the snow. So, and I mean, I farm in the wet, dry tropics, and so we can have a dry period. So, but if you go back to that soil and that soil ecosystem, obviously, if you've got plants growing as much of the year as possible, it means you've got roots and root exudates feeding that the soil organisms for as much of the year as possible. So you're maintaining their diet. By growing the diversity of plants in your cover crop, you're providing the soil organism with a diversity of food, which obviously, you know, they do better, like we do when we get a diverse diet. And in fact, you know, if we look at the improvement in the soil, however you want to measure your soil, but if you look at the improvement in your soil ecosystem, you can say that the rate of improvement will increase quite dramatically higher than if you just plant a single species on your land.
Well, it's very interesting because it appears that like it's a new way of resting the soil by kind of not resting it, really.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, when you leave the soil bare, what's feeding your soil organisms?
Yeah.
Nothing.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Ah.
And so mimicking, and so I wanted to know why you know, cover crops, a lot of people grow cover crops, but as being a scientist, I wanted to know why it worked, because I tried it at my place, and it sort of worked, but it wasn't enough. But and this is where it sort of brings in this interesting point. So what Gabe Brown is in a cold climate. I wouldn't say it was temperate. It's probably a little bit colder than sort of a temperate climate. But the warmer and wetter your climate, the more you have to feed to your soil organisms, the more plants that you have to grow within your system.
That's it.
Yeah, because if you think
that's
about,
counter-instinctual, isn't it? Really, when you think about it,
it's what? Sorry,
it's counter-instinctual. You'd think it'd be the other way around. Like, you know, in these harsher, colder climates, you'd think that they'd be the ones that need the more feeding. Then there we go.
I have to keep warm, you mean?
Yeah, I suppose so.
No, it's tied up with the rate of breakdown. In a warm and wetter climate, there's much more biological activity, and so the roots, when they're decaying in the soil, the leaves when they're deposited on the top of the soil, everything happens that much quicker. But also what happens is that because of that, and the organic material is broken down quickly, there's much more risk that the loss of nutrients down through when there's heavy rains.
Yeah.
And so in tropical environments, most of the nutrients are held in the vegetation. Yep. About 80%, and only 20% is in the soil. Yep. Whereas probably where Gabe Brown is, probably about 50-50. So his single layered prairie, or it's not exactly single layer, but low layer level of vegetation, he was enough, mimicking that, growing the cover crops. He now grows a diversity of crops within his with it as his cash crop as well, so he's adding diversity there, and he integrates livestock as well into, and he uses a thing called there's all different terms: holistic plan grazing, time controlled adaptive grazing, mob grazing, but they're extremely clever ways of mimicking the way that grazing animals naturally co-evolved with grasslands. And if you think about you know, in Africa, for example, and you're out on the Serengeti plains, and you've got maybe a mixture of different grazing animals, but they're all feeding in a tight mob. They're not there because if they go out on their own, they're going to get attacked.
Okay. Yeah.
So tight mob, you eat things that you preferred grass species, less preferred grass species. You're shitting, you're trampling. Your shit is already got lots of effective microbes in it, started the decomposition process.
Yeah.
You're trampling so that that grass that would otherwise be sticking up above the ground and going dry and oxidating and or burning is now in touch with the soil. And so it can now go be part of the food for the soil organisms. And then we even know things like that the saliva in that cows produce is a growth promotant.
Oh,
yeah. So it encourages particularly the sort of the lateral growth of grasses. So you have all that happening.
wow.
And then that mob will move on. And so what people do now is they mimic that using electric fences. And I've been doing it here on my place, and it's incredible the difference.
Wow.
Yeah. So anyway, Gabe Brown, that's what so getting that plant material, using herbivores to get that plant material recycled back into the soil, growing a diversity of cover crops, growing a diversity of crops. And that was his way of mimicking the prairie ecosystems in his area. And his yields are equivalent to the county average. His water infiltration, when they get sort of rainfall events that are quite erratic there, but when he gets a rainfall event, he gets the full benefit of it. It goes into his soil, and there's a whole lot of other measurements there that he's done and scientists have been involved with. We've got Colin Seiss as an example over here. He's using a thing called pastured cropping, where he same thing, shit hit the fan. The final straw was a fire that went through his place. What am I going to do about this? And then he came up and I think he tells the story, he tells it very well. He sort of said, I was having a beer with a mate, and the two of us thought about this idea. Why am I ploughing up? Why don't I see if I can sow my cereal crop direct into my grassland?
And look, if it works and it's assisting productivity and we're getting the best of both worlds. Absolutely tickety-poo. What are the...
and just a quick little thing about Colin is, because it's such a good example for people who want some figures, is that because he now does one pass through his field, so he uses the grazing, the cattle it's actually sheep, knock back the grasses at the turn of the season. He can then go in with one pass of his machinery, direct seed in the cereal crop, and that's it. So he says he's reduced his cost by 80%.
Wow.
And again, his yields are equivalent. And this is where just one thing I just want to add is that when people sort of say, oh, yes, but all of this stuff, it won't feed the world. We need, that older argument, organic versus industrial. We need those fertilizers if we're going to feed the world's growing population.
Yeah.
Well, if you make that direct comparison between an organic cereal producer and an industrial or conventional cereal producer, the organic may often be struggling to get the same yield. I mean, obviously, there's a hell of a lot of other services that organic producer is providing and benefits is providing, because there's not the fertilizer runoff onto the reef, blah, 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 blah. But when you start getting into this system where you start mimicking natural systems, seeing how you can mimic it, you gain in opportunities. So what Colin Seiss is doing and what Gabe Brown are doing is they've now got 2 or 3 sources of income. So by integrating livestock, they're the biomass in effect of the amount of food they're producing. It's not just cereal; it's also lamb or beef or whatever. And I'd just like to talk about it. When you get into a warmer, wetter climate, what we have to do in the tropics here is start to mimic the natural vegetation that is growing in our region, which is a multi-layered production system. And that was sort of really where some of my journey first began, because after I finished spreading all this lime out in the field, I had some students come and visit, and we went into the forest across the road and dug in the soil. And it was this little light bulb moment, like, what am I doing when the forest has got everything that I need, the earthworms, the aggregate structure, the organic matter. And so what I'm doing on this farm, and what other people are doing, you know, with syntrophic systems, with agroforestry, agro being agriculture, forestry being the combination of them, is to integrate trees into the landscape. And so that's another way that we, you know, we think about the only options that we have to grow more food is to expand horizontally. But what they're doing is farmers just need to grow up, you know, in a way. So adding vertical layers. And I'm doing that here, but there's a lovely example where that's in the Sahel region in Africa. That's a strip of dry country that's sort of the south of the Sahara Desert. And in the, I don't know if you remember, you're probably old enough to remember, in the sort of 80s and 90s, there was a lot of people starving in those areas.
The Ethiopian drought. Of course I recall.
And actually that's part of that is the same sort of thing. And they had been told, if you want to grow cereal crops, if you want to graze livestock, you know, like we were told, you don't have trees in your paddocks, you don't have trees in your fields. And so they cleared them all back. If the trees tried to grow up again, they were cut for firewood. And now there is a thing called farmer-led natural regeneration. And you can pick it up on Google Images, on Google Earth, across a huge band of the Sahel. Farmers learning from other farmers, with some advice, they have brought back their open woodlands. And a lot of it was still underground. The trees were still there. But they're using particular legume trees, that some of one particular species, which I can't pronounce, but it has an amazing ability of losing its canopy during the maize growing and sorghum growing season. So they can plant that tree at higher density, but they basically adjust the density of the tree. They choose trees with open canopies, and they're now getting higher cereal production, better livestock production. And the other thing too is they're incorporating trees that have an economic value. So I don't know if you know about shea butter. There's some cosmetics now that you'll see with SHEA on them, shea cream. It comes from that area.
I mean, that's amazing. So, like, you know, you're getting the wins from getting, you know, it's ticking every box. And again, the main thing is no effect of productivity, because understandably people kind of look at what happened in Sri Lanka and go, well, you know, we can't have those sorts of famines. But if you're ticking all the boxes, it's absolutely splendid. Look, I really wouldn't mind asking this question. A lot of the stuff that I've read on your excellent website, which I do recommend, incidentally, when you talk about the intelligence embedded in natural ecosystems, are you of the opinion that, like, there is a consciousness inherent in nature? Like, are we talking, you know, is that what's being touched on here?
No,
kind of pantheistic.
I could get into that, and we could get into that. But I think the thing that I'm more likely to emphasize to people, I mean, if these systems have been around for up to 3 billion years, and so there's been a learning, there's been a trial and testing and an experimentation that has been happening over those 3 billion years to work out, to develop systems that work. And that's why, you know, you go into a natural area and you will see so much variability according to the conditions. You know, is it the north side of the slope, the south side?
Yep.
You know, is it, what type of soil is it? Is it well drained? And so the more that we can learn from and mimic those, and that's where I think, you know, going back to that sort of agri-tech argument, is that, you know, it's great that we've got drones. I mean, we can use drones to reduce fertilizer applications and things like that. But people like Gabe Brown don't need to apply fertilizers.
Yeah.
Because they've got their nutrient recycling system happening and then their soil working again by mimicking the natural systems that would have been on their land. And I think that it's what would be really interesting is for in a way the innovation that Gabe Brown, Colin Seiss, the sort of the people that are developing ways of developing agroforestry systems, you know, there's an intellectual property involved in developing those decision-making tools, those processes. You know, let's celebrate that. Let's resource those. So instead of spending all this money on basically adding equipment that enables us to be more efficient with the way that we substitute for nature's free ecological services, let's acknowledge and learn from nature and develop innovative ways to bring back nature's free ecological services.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Oh, yeah. What I'm hearing is to utilize the pre-existing systems and to bolster and enhance the pre-existing systems rather than coming in over the top. I hope I've interpreted that correctly. Wow. Well, see, that's a fantastic, that's a very interesting conceptual framework, if I may make the observation.
You know, Matt, just maybe one last thing I'd just like to share is looking back. I mean, I was fascinated. Why I was an ecologist. Why didn't I see that it was the system? Why was I still trying to treat repair the parts of the system rather than, you know, the overall ecosystem? And it's really, so I did a bit of research. And there's a cultural bias that we have in the West. And obviously this is a generalization, but we tend to focus in the West on the individual elements, the discrete parts of the system. And so we focus on improving those rather than the system itself. Whereas in Eastern cultures and indigenous cultures, they focus more on the relationships. And so I think in a way that we're trained not to see the system, because it should sort of be pretty it should be sort of pretty obvious. It should have been obvious to me as an ecologist.
I totally agree. Like I lived in China for a year, and the spectacular scenery you see there, of course, being human beings, like we associate that, you know, nature, untrammeled, untamed nature with natural beauty. And well, we should, because it is. But some of the most beautiful landscapes I saw over there, Doctor, were these, you know, magnificent terraced rice fields over these, you know, some of it's really hard, like it's tough country too. It's some of the most aesthetically pleasing, beautiful country you'll see. It's amazingly diverse because there's all kind of, because rice is obviously their main cereal crop. There's all sorts of animals that are, you know, that are living with the rise and the fall of the water and the rice. And it's a really in tune ecosystem that has surprisingly high amounts of biodiversity, and again gets to rest itself. So it kind of, yeah, that conceptual framework idea, it kind of fits in. It's resonating with me because it fits in with my experience having seen that over there. But again, this idea that like these were food growing places. People, you know, these locations have been under human agriculture for, you know, literally thousands and thousands of years. And so they're farming fish at some time of the year and they're farming rice at other times of the year. And you know, you see all those trees and stuff growing through there. Yeah, it resonates precisely with my experience, if I can say.
and the and ducks incorporated. And also, you know, I mean, I was in China in 1988, and at that time they still had, every farmer had a drop toilet at the side of their along the road. And that system, yeah, I'm trying to think, is it Howard? I think his name is Howard, wrote about 1,000 years of agriculture. And I've probably got the title of the book wrong as well, but it's something like that. And it was because it was a closed loop. You know, it was that they were living as part of the ecosystem, so that the human waste wasn't put out, you know, discharged into the ocean. It was being recycled directly back onto the fields again. So
that's such a cool conceptual framework, because again, like, I think in the West, and especially recently, we see ourselves as separate from the environment rather than a natural part of it. And human beings are treated as a kind of like virus on the planet, which is, you know, I think is just a ridiculous, stupid idea. But that's why you get that dissonance. It's a conceptual framework issue. That's why you're getting that dissonance, rather than the conceptualization of human beings as part of. And it's like, yes, our poo matters. Like, it has a place. You know what I mean? It's not just for treatment. But look, if you don't mind, we'll have a quick look at your website too, and some of your publications. So that's where people would want to go if they want to find out more.
Yeah, and yes, thanks for highlighting those. So they're all available either as licensed PDFs, and the Ecological Farming and Ecological Gardening Handbook people also can purchase as hard copies. I've produced them print on demand so that they can be, the information can be kept very up to date. You know, obviously the science and the experiences of farmers and gardeners is changing all of the time, and my learnings are improving all the time, so I can keep the contents of all of that very much up to date.
And so yeah, it's definitely worth a view. So it's learningfromnature.com.au, and I've just ducked on the publications, but it's a site that's really it's really worth having a look at, if I can plug the heck out of it. And I love the eco-logically. I think that's kind of cool. The thing I like about the conceptual framework that you've got, Doc, if I can make the observations, it's kind of, I'll come out and say this, it's kind of
Common
very
sense.
It reminds me of the Logos. It's like this idea that we've got to be motivated by love but guided by truth. So that's the scientific truth, but like, you're being motivated by love, and not just love of nature, which is part of it clearly, but it's love of humanity too. It's not this idea that, you know, human beings are a sort of virus, and, you know, there's got to be less of us and all this kind of stuff, which I find well, disconcerting, really. This idea that, you know, we're getting all of these things together. It's great. I really like the approach. That's something that appeals to me with your work.
Yeah, and I mean, just a couple of things I'd like to share. I think I'd like to share that, you know, it's not just bringing back the ecosystems on our farms and gardens. You know, people are talking now about the circular economy. That's become quite a big of a sort of a sort of growing theme, and which is a closed loop system. But if we, you know, the biosphere as a whole is an ecosystem, and then basically ecosystems, I hope we've talked about ecosystems all the way through. I hope everybody sort of understands really what it is. I mean, they're sort of semi self-contained. A good way of thinking about it is like a pond. There's a whole lot of things that happen in, there's plants that's growing, there's insects in there, but there's things that, you know, nutrients and that are coming in from outside in terms of leaves, and there's insects flying out and all that sort of stuff. So it's semi-enclosed. But, you know, ultimately, when you're talking about the sort of the role or the way that human lives on the planet, the more that we can move to just seeing that the solutions really lie by using that wisdom that's embedded in natural systems. Yeah, so the pond is a sort of semi-enclosed, but there's nutrients and energy coming from outside, you know, with the insects flying in, the leaves coming in, the insects metamorphosing, and, you know, the dragonflies leaving the pond system and whatever. And but there's a whole lot of things that happen within that. There's the the nutrient cycling, there's the capture of solar energy, and then how that's used and flows through the system. There's the water cycle, but the whole system is designed wherever is to be to use those nutrients and energy super efficiently. It doesn't produce any waste. It doesn't produce any pollution. Everything is reused and recycled, and it's run on renewable energy. And so if you think about a lot of the things that we do outside of growing food in other sectors of our society to be more sustainable, we're trying to switch to renewable energy. We're trying to reuse things, to recycle things, to reduce waste, to reduce pollution. And so that, I think the more that we can look at just sort of say, well, how does an ecosystem work and how can we mimic that in the way that we run our societies? That to me is the answer in terms of creating a regenerative and sustainable society into the future. Yeah,
great, win-win, and no Sri Lanka. That's the that's the main thing. Well, this has been a fantastic conversation. Is there anything else that you'd like to add?
No, I think that's probably it. Other than that, it's when we go to the root cause of the problems. It's like, a doctor can have 10 people coming into his practice or her practice in the morning, and they can all have different symptoms, and the solution could all be that they should be, for example, getting better exercise. And the root cause is not getting enough exercise. And it's the same. The root cause of the issues that we have is that I suppose the take-home message is I would love to share is growing food ecologically. We recognize that we need to repair the root cause of the problem is the fact that we don't have functioning ecosystems in our farms and gardens. And that simplifies things a whole lot. It doesn't mean to say we can't put some lime on the soil to kickstart getting the plants growing, because we want to grow more plants to get more food to feed the soil organisms. It doesn't mean to say we can't sort of use organic pest controls or whatever, but in the long term, above ground, we're looking at building a pest-resistant landscape. But the thing is it becomes actually quite simple. And I think if, we can't expect every gardener in Australia or in the far north, even the far north of Queensland, to want to know the ins and outs of soil science. And in fact, even, myself, I've studied soil science. It's so bloody complex. Yeah. So isn't it better that if we want to move forward and do things in a better way, to be able to give people a simple message of being able to do that? And with the soils, it's just a matter of giving your soil organisms a more generous, diverse, and as much of the year or consistent food supply as possible. Roots, root exudates, and the organic matter that drops on the soil. Yeah, it's pretty simple conceptually. Like you said, using the doctor example. So if you have someone turning up and they've got, I've got blood pressure, I've got all these other problems, and the doctor just says, take these pills rather than get off your ass and exercise, the first thing you need to do is get another GP, because they're not addressing what's causing the problem. Yeah, and the pills are in a way, same thing as applying, heaps of fertilizers and things. And, and this, sorry, just the other thing I think people would be interested in is that, there's been lots of research that's been done over the years where it's compared organic produce with non-organic produce, and looked at the nutritional content of the food. And often the organic is higher, but it's not always. But what they haven't done is related that back to what the soil, how healthy the soil is. And there was two recent studies that have been done in the States where they've actually looked at some of the parameters in the soil. And the one I'm sort of thinking of mainly is it looked at the amount of organic matter, the amount of microbes, and the microbial activity. Those were the three measurements that they took. And where that was higher, the nutrition was higher in the food. But the thing that I would like to say is that then people say, oh yeah, so if I put on lots of biofertilizers that got tons of microbes in, and if I put tons of mulch on, I'm going to get more nutritious food. But none of that will happen unless you've got a functioning soil ecosystem, because you're not going to get the microbes and you're not going to get the organic matter without all of those processes creating those chocolate covered biscuits.
We're back at the biscuits. Well, look, thank you so much. I think that's wrapped it up perfectly.